In the late 1980s, toy shelves were dominated by Hot Wheels and Matchbox, until Galoob's Micro Machines stormed onto the scene in 1987. Barely 2 inches long, these tiny cars became a phenomenon, outselling their bigger rivals and filling living rooms with pocket-sized playsets. By 1991, the craze was so strong that British developer Codemasters decided to bring them to the Nintendo Entertainment System. But this wasn't just another racing game. With no official Nintendo license, Codemasters had to reverse engineer the console, patch game-breaking bugs with hardware tricks, and reimagine what an entire racing game could be. The result was a top-down racer where kitchen tables, pool halls, and sand pits became chaotic circuits, and its head-to-head multiplayer made it one of the most memorable party games of the era. Today, we're racing through the history of toys, reverse engineering, and the tiniest tracks in gaming by bringing you the history of Micro Machines. So grab your cereal box barricades, line up your pencils for ramps, and join us for today's tiniest trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 280th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. This week, we're shrinking down to the world of Micro Machines, the 1991 racing game based on Galoob's blockbuster toy line. We'll look at how a prototype dune buggy racer became a licensed hit, how Codemasters built an NES game without Nintendo's blessing, how the J-Kart made 4-player mayhem possible, and why the series still stands as one of the most inventive party racers of the 90s. Along the way, we'll also dive into the history of the toys themselves, their meteoric rise, and their eventual fall. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who still manages to take a full-sized seat in a world built for toy cars. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, when you play Micro Machines, are you the kind of person who learns to track, or do you just immediately start flipping the furniture and calling it a strategy?
Flipped furniture will always be a strategy, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, you have to avoid it either way.
Yeah, exactly. So you might as well put it there so it's known that it's got to be avoided.
One way or the other, you are always getting in the way. All right, start with the toy. Did you ever play with Micro Machines?
Oh, yeah. I had the little collector's box and then the one of the tracks, I'm sure. Well, it was either Micro Machines or something very similar to Micro Machines.
Right. Yeah, you had the tiny cars.
Yeah, exactly.
What about the video games? Any video games in the series?
I know I played one of them, but I don't remember it other than just being tiny cars that you raced around in a living room or setting, like, indoor setting.
I gotcha. All right. Well, there's a whole story behind the Micro Machines and the video game, the first one, and to be fair, the entire series. We kind of cover the whole gamut. But before we get there, why don't you share with our listeners what else has happened during the current week in gaming history?
All right, kicking it off on January 8th, 1991, Konami released Operation C for the Game Boy in Japan, marking the handheld debut of the Contra series. Designed as a portable take on the run-and-gun formula, the game featured side-scrolling stages mixed with top-down shooting levels, echoing the NES classics while introducing its own power-up system. Despite the Game Boy's limitation, Konami delivered fast action and tight controls that captured the spirit of Contra on a smaller screen. Though shorter than its console counterparts, Operation C showed how a big name franchise could be effectively adapted for handheld play, cementing itself as one of the early standout titles for the Game Boy.
I don't have much to say about it because it's really just like a watered down version of Contra. Like that's what all Game Boy games were though. They were like because the Game Boy was more basic hardware, they were watered down versions of every game ever.
Hey man, not my Tank Commander.
They were fun though. I had a lot of Game Boy. I still have my game. I found my Game Boy last week while I was going through some stuff. They're a lot of fun. I found a Game Boy. Not going to say it's my Game Boy because the person that it belongs to listens to this podcast. He knows who he is and who it is, whose Game Boy it is. So
Yeah,
I
it's
found
me. Just kidding.
no, I found a Game Boy. But hey, still have one. Still have games.
Right on. Well, next up, on January 6, 1999, Legend Entertainment, known for narrative driven adventure games and later contributions to first person shooters, was acquired by GT Interactive. Founded by Bob Bates and Mike Verdu, Legend had carved out a niche in the early 1990s with text and graphic ventures like Spellcasting 101 and Eric the Unready, before transitioning to licensed titles such as Mission Critical and The Wheel of Time. The acquisition of GT Interactive promised greater resources and publishing reach, but it also marked the beginning of the end for the studio's independence. Within a few years, shifting priorities and the eventual absorption of GT into Infogrames Atari led to Legend's closure in 2004. Still, the acquisition stands out as a turning point in the consolidation era of PC gaming, when many mid-sized developers were swallowed by larger publishers navigating the rapidly growing market.
No joke. The subtitle for Spellcasting 101, the actual title of Spellcasting 101 is Spellcasting 101 Sorcerers Get All the Girls.
Hell yeah, that's the badass name right there.
It's funny. I've been posting daily gaming history videos and it's in one for Legend Entertainment. So check it out.
Check it out.
Yes.
Speaking of things to check out, back in episode 71, we talked about a great game that I love very much. When on January 4th, 2001, the beta of RuneScape launched in browsers worldwide, laying the foundation for one of the longest running MMORPGs in history. Developed by Andrew and Paul Gower, it began as a small project built in Java, allowing players to log in from almost any computer and immediately join a living fantasy world. Its free-to-play model, simple graphics, and low system requirements gave it wide accessibility, drawing millions of players into quests, PvP duels, and skill grinding. Over time, it evolved into a global community and a pioneer of online persistence, eventually splitting into the modern RuneScape 3 and nostalgic old-school RuneScape. Few MMOs have shown such staying power with a player base that remains dedicated decades later. So, again, if you want to check out that full story, episode 71, Run Escape.
Check out the episode. Rob could gab for hours about RuneScape, so I'll just leave it to that.
Indeed. But something Dave can gab about for hours was on January 10th, 2008, when the original SimCity was released as open source software under the new title Micropolis, giving fans unprecedented access to the code that birthed the city building genre. Legal hurdles prevented Electronic Arts from releasing the game under the SimCity name, but Will Wright's 1989 classic was nonetheless preserved, rebranded, and distributed under the GPL license. This release not only safeguarded a cornerstone of PC gaming history, but also invited programmers, educators, and hobbyists to dissect and reimagine its mechanics. By turning SimCity into Micropolis, the game became a teaching tool as much as a historical artifact, ensuring new generations could learn from its elegant simulation systems while continuing to keep its legacy alive in classrooms, archives, and fan projects.
Go play Micropolis.
Yeah, go do that.
Go play Micropolis.
Go play Micropolis.
Good. It's a good time sink. Absolutely a great time sink. Speaking of, no, the next one's not time sink. Next one's a cool as I'll get out game though.
Sure, Dave. We'll listen to what you say on that. And for those wondering, he's talking about when on July 4th, 2016, indie developer Daniel Mullins released Pony Island for Steam. A game that was anything but the cheerful title its name suggested. What began as a simple arcade-style pony jumping game quickly twisted into a meta-narrative horror experience, where players battled a corrupted arcade machine seemingly possessed by the devil. Blending puzzle solving, glitchy platforming, and unsettling fourth wall breaks, Pony Island constantly subverted expectations, even turning menus and system files into part of the gameplay. Its quirky humor and eerie atmosphere earned widespread acclaim, with critics praising it as one of the most inventive indie releases of the decade. More than just a game, it was a commentary on the medium itself, setting the stage for Mullins' later projects like The Hex and Inscription. Pony Island proved that the strangest ideas could leave the deepest impressions. And with that, Dave, I think people are tired of hearing about, well, the past to hear the past.
Yep. Yeah, if they're tired of hearing in the past, they definitely picked the wrong podcast.
Well, maybe they like hearing about tiny things. So let's tell them about tiny.
Ooh, I wasn't sure where that was going. Do we ever really talk about the future though? I don't know. No, I don't know.
Well, it's bleak, Dave. But you know it's not. Micro machines.
No, they're pretty bleak too, actually, unfortunately. For those of you who don't know, the Micro Machines are a line of toys that were created by a company called Galoob, a San Francisco based toy company that was founded way back in 1957. Galoob is best known for two things. One being the game Genie, which we actually will talk about in a future episode. And the other thing being these here micro machines. Now, originally, Galoob made all sorts of toys, from die-cast cars to dolls, but it wasn't until the late 80s that they struck gold. Up until that point, the toy car market was dominated by other giants you may know, like Hot Wheels and Matchbox. And so the question arose, how could Galoob compete with those dominant companies? And the answer that they came up with was by going smaller, much smaller. Probably one of the few times that that concept actually works. And so the Micro Machines line was released in 1987. Micro Machine cars were barely 2 inches long, and that's about half the size of the competition. But they were detailed. They were painted to look like real cars, trucks, planes, there were even boats. And they came in themed packs. There were military sets, construction sets, exotic sports car sets. There were endless ways for kids to collect micro machines. And because they were so small and inexpensive per se, they felt cheap enough, I guess is a good way to put it, for parents to buy multiples at once. And as Rob kind of alluded in the beginning when I asked him if he ever played with micro machines, Galoob didn't really stop with the cars either. They introduced entire play sets that folded up into little carry cases. There were cities and gas stations. There was even an aircraft carrier. These were all little play sets that could literally fit into your pocket. That portability was huge because unlike the other toy cars, unlike the Hot Wheels and the Matchbox cars, you didn't need a giant playmat. You didn't need a toy room. You didn't need all this floor space to be able to play with these cars.
You didn't
You
need
could
Dave, but you could still have.
you could definitely still have. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. You could literally take an entire world of micro machines to school or to a friend's house. And then, of course, there was the marketing. In the late 80s and early 90s, Galoob unleashed one of the more memorable ad campaigns of the decade, starring John Moschitta Jr., the quote unquote fast talker that was famous for his Guinness World Record breaking speech speed. That's right, this guy was an incredibly fast talker. In TV commercials, he would deliver a mile a minute spiel about micro machines that kids couldn't forget. Now, those ads are iconic. even to the point where some people today still remember the commercials even more so than the toys themselves. By 1989, Micro Machines had become the best selling toy car line in America. By that point, they were outselling even Hot Wheels. So, for a brief window in time, they weren't just the competition, they were king of the hill. And so, the brand, as it was exploding in popularity, Galoob was expanding it beyond measure, right? They expanded into boats and planes. There were tanks. There were Star Wars licensed Micro Machines. There were Star Trek licensed Micro Machines in the 90s. They were everywhere. So when Codemasters went to make a game in 1990, they weren't working with some niche brand. They were adapting one of the hottest toy lines of the late 80s and early 90s, which gave the project instant credibility with kids and parents alike. Now, at the dawn of the 1990s, the British games industry was in a transition. Studios that had cut their teeth on open architecture home computers like the ZX Spectrum, the Commodore 64, and the Amiga were now facing the rise of closed off console systems, like the NES, the Mega Drive. By the end of the 90s, we had the Super Nintendo on the way. And for many of these companies, it was adapt or die. Codemasters, which would go on to make Micro Machines, was founded by David and Richard Darling, and they had built their reputation on budget computer games like Dizzy and Grand Prix Simulator. But when the brothers came and toured the United States, they were stunned to see Nintendo games sold in gas stations. It was their first glimpse of video games as a true mass market phenomenon. And so at the Consumer Electronics Show in 1989, they visited Nintendo's booth, hoping to get a meeting with Nintendo to build a relationship with Nintendo, but they were brushed off. And so, if they wanted into the NES market, they would have to do it without Nintendo's blessing. And so they turned to a talented coder who had been with Codemasters since his school days, in fact, named Andrew Graham. And Andrew Graham's first NES assignment, as they were trying to get into this market, was to port a game called Treasure Island Dizzy. But since they didn't have a relationship with Nintendo, they didn't have a dev kit, right? And so they had to improvise. And so Graham turned to a hardware guru in the company named Ted Karen, and they reverse engineered the Nintendo, right? And they built a custom development kit. It was a circuit board wired through a Commodore 64 into a PC using a cross compilation. It sounds crazy because it was. Somehow, though, it worked.
Yeah, I can't even understand that.
So, impressed by the fact that they were able to first reverse engineer this, and then Andrew Graham, was then able to port Treasure Island Dizzy over. The Darlings rather, asked Graham what he wanted to make next. And his answer was a racing game. That concept became the California Buggy Boys. I don't know why, but that makes me giggle every time.
Yeah, I don't know why, Dave.
California Buggy Boys was a prototype. It was inspired by Atari's Rally Speedway. It was a top-down dune buggy racer with a head-to-head mode that avoided split screen by keeping both players on one screen. If you fell too far behind, you lost a point. And so the way they developed it, it was a competitive system. It was tense, and the simplicity of it being on one screen and so on and so forth made it absolutely perfect for the NES hardware. At the same time, Codemasters was also developing the game Genie cheat cartridge, which, like I said, we'll talk about in an episode later this year, and that brought them into contact with Galoob Toys in the US. During their talks with Galoob, during their visits to the United States, the Darlings spotted micro machines filling toy shelves everywhere. This was the period of time in which it was an absolute phenomenon, right? Propelled by those fast talking commercials and what looked like an unmatched collectability. And so, sensing the opportunity, sensing the synergy, they pitched to Galoob a Micro Machines video game. Now, Galoob wasn't interested in making video games themselves, but they did agree to license the brand. And luckily, Codemasters already had what they considered to be a perfect prototype to reskin. So California Buggy Boys was about to become Micro Machines. Now, Andrew Graham wasn't initially thrilled about swapping his dune buggies for tiny toy cars, but illustrator Nigel Fletcher suggested a stroke of genius that would go on to define the game. And his suggestion was, don't put the toys in realistic environments. Put them in the kinds of places kids actually played with them. Kitchen tables, school desks, bathtubs, sand pits, and garden patios all would become racetracks. Everyday objects would become obstacles: cereal boxes as walls, pencils as barriers, playing cards as ramps, and spilled milk as water hazards. And they were on board. It was the suggestion that kind of made California Buggies click as a Micro Machines title, so they started to make the change. Now, Graham, for his credit, was obsessed over handling, right? He wanted to make the cars drift and skid just right so that jumps and landings felt satisfying. And they had to work everything, might I remind you, through the NES hardware. The NES hardware had very strict limitations, right? It was only 128K cartridge size. You had to do it with, what is it, 8x8 sprites. Your character tile budget was 256 characters. And somehow Graham and an artist, Paul Perot, wrung charm out of those constraints. They used deluxe paint and built other custom tools to handle the visuals, and cleverly developed invisible arrow maps to handle the AI, which by modern standards, the AI was very simple, but in practice, for NES era standards, it genuinely worked. Now, the real genius of Micro Machines, if you ask many people, is going to be the multiplayer. Codemasters had always leaned into couch co-op gaming, right? BMX Simulator on the Commodore 64, for instance, supported 4 players sharing a single keyboard. On the Nintendo, developing the game as a single screen head-to-head system kind of made every race a knife fight. The closer you got to the screen edge, the less you could see ahead, and that created constant tension. As David Darling would later put it, there was never a dull moment because the system forced you to always be neck and neck. Now, the development of Micro Machines wasn't without hiccups. The lockout chip on the Nintendo proper meant that Codemasters had to distribute the game through a company called Camerica using unlicensed cartridges. We have done an episode on unlicensed cartridges before. It was our Wisdom Tree episode, the Bible company, the company that made Bible themed video games. They also tried to distribute unlicensed cartridges and had similar issues in that retailers did not want to carry unlicensed cartridges because they didn't want to upset Nintendo, who controlled the other 98% of the market, right?
True. Not a good idea.
Not a good idea. Don't mess off the person who has the majority of your supply. So they really struggled to get it on the shelves for starters. What little retailers did agree to carry it, you know, I guess is a good way to put it. And they, unlicensed cartridges, whenever you do an unlicensed cartridge, you have to engineer hardware workarounds to bypass Nintendo's lockout chip. And so that means adding more chips to the cartridge, which increased the cost. And so it was inevitably a little bit of a complicated process to get Micro Machines made as an NES cartridge. Worse still, just before release, testers discovered a fatal bug. If you pressed reverse at the starting grid, the game crashed. By the time they noticed this, there were thousands of cartridges that had already been manufactured. And so, in order to fix this, what they came up with is kind of clever. They actually embedded another chip, a patch chip inside the cartridges. It is literally a baked in game genie that corrects a single bad line of code. So when Micro Machines finally released in 91, it literally shipped with a tiny patch box inside the cartridge to fix a single bad byte.
That's wild. That's
I agree.
you don't hear about that.
I agree, Rob. There's literally something hilarious about a video game that had to ship with a tiny little patch inside the cartridge just to work.
Yeah, talk about the ultimate cheat code. Built right in, no game genie required.
And while Micro Machines was solving bugs in creative waves, maybe it's time for all of you to solve your own podcasting problems with Zencaster, the all-in-one platform that makes recording a breeze.
Right. If Codemaster could reverse engineer the NES to make this game, you can definitely figure out how to hit record in your browser.
Exactly. Zencaster lets you record high quality audio and video straight from your web browser. There's no complicated setups, no blocky hardware. Just send your guest a link and you're off to the races.
And once you finish, Zencaster's post-production tools clean it up automatically. It's like having a pit crew for your podcast. Levels your audios, reduces background noises, and even polishes out those awkward pauses.
And then when you're ready, you can publish directly to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else your listeners listen, all from a single platform.
So if you've got a story to tell, whether it's about tiny toy cars, racing chaos, or anything in between, Zencaster's got you covered.
Head over to zencaster.com/pricing. Use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan.
That's zencastr.com/memory card lane. Don't stall out. Start your podcast today. And now let's fire the engines back up and see how Micro Machines expanded from the NES onto new systems across the 90s.
So Micro Machines gets released in 1991, and it's a success. It capitalizes on the popularity of the toys. The game itself is a lot of fun. We had Micro Machines for the NES. I played the ever living heck out of that one. It was so cool to race around on school desks and breakfast tables. I can't remember those are the only two levels I remember right now. Like, I'm beating my head up against it, but I definitely remember having to race on a school desk to where like the pencils were creating the path, and then I think you jumped over binders. I remember playing cards in a level. Playing cards were like towers of playing cards were the ramps. In any case, it was a ton of fun. There were other mini car games like RC Pro AM we've talked about before in a few episodes that was like a racing game with little cars. I remember the off-road series, Ivan Something's off-road series. That was a lot of fun. That was tiny cars. But Micro Machines did it in a way that it made sense. They were tiny cars, but they weren't in their normal environments. Like, they were tiny cars in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Like, you were racing on Micro Machine environments, and that made it very cool. Didn't do a lot of multiplayer on it. I mean, I did enough to. I wasn't a fan of couch co-op. Like, you'd get so far ahead and then if the other person was behind, like it would slow you down. I always found that irritating.
Oh
But
yeah, that's fair. I can understand that.
yeah, but I loved Micro Machines. Loved Micro Machines. It was an absolute ton of fun. So the first NES game, I'm a big fan. I spent a lot of time on it as a kid in 91, 92, somewhere in there. Fantastic. After the success of the first game, its original programmer Andrew Graham had gone back to university. So Codemasters didn't want to wait for Graham to come back. They turned to Peter Williamson of Supersonic Software to handle a sequel. Now, Supersonic had just finished a game called Cosmic Spacehead, and Williamson was itching to design something new. Now, Codemasters' direction was very clear. We want you to capture the magic of the original Micro Machines game, but expand it in every single way possible. So development began in 1993. They chose the Mega Drive as the lead platform. That's Sega's Mega Drive. And we've talked about the Mega Drive before. The Mega Drive was technologically just a superior system to the rest. Didn't have the popularity initially. Definitely, eventually carved into the market. But technologically, it was a superior system. Now, right away, Williamson and that development team focused on physics and variety. Vehicles could now have different handling profiles, right? So heavier cars were slower and sturdier, but lighter ones would zip around with twitchier controls. They added variables like tire friction and wheel lock. These were all designed to make every vehicle unique, right? Because in the first one, they all just kind of drove the same, they just looked different. Williamson would later admit in interviews that they were designing the game for themselves. They were prioritizing fun over realism because slow, boring cars simply weren't entertaining. Now, these changes and the stuff they added to a sequel doubled the size of the game compared to the original. But these were very clever programmers, and thanks to compression techniques that they added and used, they were able to keep the game running on a standard cart. And that extra room allowed Codemasters to experiment with something that would be revolutionary to the series, and this is called the J cart. The J cart was conceived by the Darling brothers, David and Richard, and essentially it is a cartridge that has two additional controller ports built directly into it. And so the system only had two controller ports, and so the cartridge would have two ports, and this would let four players race at once without adding any extra hardware to the console. You just needed four controllers.
So you're saying that the controller's plugged into the cartridge.
The controllers plug directly into the cartridge, yes.
That is weird.
It is
I don't know how
so
I feel
weird.
about that. That's something. Yeah, I've never even considered that to be a thing before.
That turned Micro Machines 2 into a true party game because now what was just a two-player game could be a four-player couch co-op game. And to be fair, Codemasters even toyed with the idea of having players shared controllers, believing that if they pulled it off, they could squeeze up to 8 people into a single race. That didn't pan out though.
Yeah, I was gonna
Or
say that
was
seems like a little much.
Yeah, that didn't pan out. But it turned the series from one about one-on-one competition into a living room free for all. Now, of course, new series, so graphics were also upgraded. Supersonic leaned on Amiga tools. They leaned on a company called Big Red Software that they partnered with for extra support. There was an artist called Mark Nisam handling much of the backgrounds. And so, with all this extra support, there were more colors and more details, and that meant that the everyday environments would come to life in new ways. There would be a sponge bobbing in a sink. A darkened track would be lit dramatically. There was even a race that takes you across a toilet seat. So
Nice.
there were fun cultural touches too. A co-presenter of a UK gaming show called Bad Influence named Violet Berlin visited Codemasters during development. While she was there, they snapped her photo and they inserted her as a playable character. They didn't make her the fastest racer though, and even she requested to be the fastest, and they said, not the plan. So
Aw,
she didn't get
darn.
everything. No, she didn't get everything she hoped for. So Micro Machines 2 Turbo Tournament is what it was end up called. It was released on November 25th, 1994 for the Mega Drive. Instant smash hit. Sold over 250,000 copies and really helped cement the series as a staple of multiplayer gaming in the mid 90s. They even had added non volatile memory to the cartridge, which let players save lap times and records. So you had that added on to the first game, too. Its success meant that Codemasters was ready to stick the game everywhere, frankly. Ports followed for the MS-DOS, the Game Gear, the Super Nintendo. It was on the Game Boy. The sequel, Micro Machines 2, was accessible across pretty much every major platform at the time. After Turbo Tournament cemented the series' reputations, Codemasters kept the pedal down. In 1996, Supersonic Software followed it up with Micro Machines Military for the Mega Drive. It was a spin-off that swapped sports cars for what else but tanks, helicopters, and armored jeeps, adding weapons and a little bit of combat chaos to the familiar tabletop formula. It didn't exactly reinvent the series, but it did scratch an itch for fans who wanted a more explosive twist. So think like vehicular combat games, so to speak. And so the next big leap came shortly later in 1997 with Micro Machines V3 on the original PlayStation. Andrew Graham was back from university. He returned to lead development on the game. He brought the franchise into 3D for the first time. Now, that jump was particularly risky, right? Because shrinking cars in a full 3D space could be awkward. But this team was well versed and it ended up working surprisingly well. They developed a new engine that allowed for ramps and vertical drops. There were textured environments. They had playful little details. We all know I think the details matter. So there was reflections in ponds, covers on school books that poked fun at 80s and 90s culture, which was a throwback to, the original games. It was a labor of love that carried the series over into 3D. And for many fans, V3 became to them the definitive Micro Machines experience of the 90s, balancing the series' party game roots with the excitement of 3D polygon graphics. As technology kept moving forward, so too did the series. Micro Machines 64 Turbo hit what else but the Nintendo 64 in 1999, bringing with it the 4-player split screen chaos that by that time the console was famous for, thanks to what game? What game made Nintendo
Super Smash
64?
Bros.
Oh, that's a good choice. That wasn't what I was thinking, but that's an excellent choice. I was thinking
Pokemon
GoldenEye.
Stadium.
That one too. It was that was a great system for 4-player chaos, wasn't it?
I don't think
No, Pokemon Stadium
Stadium.
did
It
not.
was just two.
Yeah, but still,
Mario Kart.
GoldenEye, Mario Kart's a fantastic choice. Mario Kart, Smash Brothers, GoldenEye. It was a great
See,
system for 4 players. Around that same time, there were ports and bundles that all kept the franchise alive on handhelds. They brought it to the Game Boy Color by packaging Turbo Tournament with the original, per se. Now, the 2000s brought some experimentation to the series. Codemasters released Micro Machines version 4 in 2006 for the PlayStation 2, inevitably the PlayStation Portable, the Nintendo DS, and they brought it into the PC realm as well.
Huh.
Micro Machines V4 leaned very much, speaking of Pokemon, into the collect them all mechanic. It featured over 750 vehicles that
Wow.
players could unlock, swap, and race. That's impressive for a 2006 title.
That's insane.
That's I mean, we say we don't have that now, and we don't in a lot of games. There are games that have that. I mean, Horizon probably have that? The Gran Turismo's probably have that. We have that, but in 2006, I think that's a very impressive scale.
I mean, I'd say even still, it's impressive. It's
Yeah,
like you
you're
said,
right.
there's only select titles that do it.
You are so right. Micro Machines V4 also introduced weapons in a more pronounced way than had previously been used. We talked about Mario Kart. They were definitely echoing kart racers like Mario Kart while keeping the tiny scale environments intact. Since V4, the series has really only popped up sporadically. There are mobile versions and handheld ports and re releases that have kept the brand on life support, so to speak, but none of them have reached the cultural peak of that early 90s to late 90s, run of games. In 2017, Codemasters even attempted a reboot with Micro Machines World Series, which added online multiplayer and arena battle modes. Micro Machines World Series came and it went. They shut down the online servers for the game in March of 2024. So it definitely didn't stick. Definitely
I
did
guess it
not
did
stick.
not. But, some things do, some things don't.
By the late 90s, Micro Machines had kind of cemented itself as one of the great party racing series. Between the NES debut, the brilliance of its sequel in Turbo Tournament, and that leap into 3D with V3, and then the collectability of V4. Those games had reached millions of players and had kind of carved out a reputation for chaotic, laughter filled multiplayer. For many, Micro Machines wasn't just a racing game. It was a social experience, right? The kind of title that literally would come out at birthday parties and sleepovers and family nights. There are a lot of games nowadays that are social experiences that we play online. This was a social experiment played in person because that's what we had at the time. That timing was interesting though, because while the games were thriving through the 90s, the toys that inspired them were beginning to lose steam. After years of topping sales charts, Micro Machines found itself in decline by the mid 1990s. The tastes of children were shifting, competitors like Hot Wheels were regaining momentum, and frankly, the novelty of pocket sized cars kind of was starting to wear off by that point. Hasbro ended up buying Galoob in 1998, and to their credit, they tried to keep the line alive with licensed tie ins, but realistically, the Micro Machines craze, the Micro Machines craze had realistically already peaked. By the early 2000s, in between V3 and V4, the toys were mostly gone from toy shelves. They were living on as collector's items and nostalgic pieces, right? In a lot of ways, Micro Machines, by the time V4 had come out, had become the games, Micro Machines, the video games, had kind of become the lasting face of the brand. Because even as the toys disappeared, Micro Machines kept racing forward through Micro Machines 64 Turbo and then V4 and most modernly World Series in 2017, right? Not every entry hit those same high notes as the originals, but there's some merit in the fact that the franchise kind of survived long past its physical counterpart, right? After the toys were gone, video games were still there. And that really just goes to show you how strong of a party concept, how strong of a concept the video games were. That concept never changed throughout the years. What made Micro Machines stand out in 1991 is what fans still remember today. Those tiny cars in giant environments and this pure joy that comes with competitive mayhem. Codemasters took this spirit of kids' imaginations, the idea of lining up toy cars on a breakfast table or your school desk, on a toilet, in a bathroom, on a toilet seat, and they kind of
Gross.
turned it into a digital experience that was chaotic and even more fun with your friends. For Codemasters, it was more than just a quirky licensed game. Micro Machines ended up giving them credibility in console development, and that is a foundation that would lead to them to be able to work on other heavyweight racing games for the consoles like Colin McRae Rally, and eventually the Grid series, and now the F1 series. For players, though, it's a reminder that sometimes the smallest things can leave the biggest mark. And for those of us that grew up with both the toys and the games, I mean, it's a double shot of nostalgia, right? A cultural moment where the line between the living room floor and the TV screen blurred, and racing on the edge of a kitchen table became one of the biggest thrills of the 90s. So while the toys may have faded, the Micro Machine games ensured that the brand lived on, proving once again that sometimes the smallest things can leave a big legacy. And of course, this is just one stop on our trip down memory card lane. If you'd like to explore more of racing's history, you can revisit episode 233, where we covered Crazy Taxi, or episode 262, where we dove into the motorcycle mayhem of Road Rash. We've also touched on simulation racing hybrids in episode 173. That's on Gran Turismo. So lots of different ways for you to explore video game racing history. You can, of course, find these and all of our other episodes wherever you listen to podcasts or on our website at www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can listeners find on our website?
You can find the calendar to see our future episode topics, know what we'll be talking about in coming weeks. You can find a link to our Discord where you can come chat with Dave and I about, gaming stuff. You can find links to our Patreon where you can help support us and get access to the ad-free and unedited versions of all of our episodes. And you can find links to our social media where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor, and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a person, a technology. We've even covered a museum and a circus. When we sit down to research new topics each week, the most exciting part is finding out new and interesting things about the games we already know. Then we get to come on here and teach you all these fun things. It's a fantastic cycle of teaching and learning, which we celebrate by going roundtable and talking about what we have learned. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, there's two pretty big ones for me for today. One is the idea of the reverse engineering, how they used a Commodore 64 and a PC and all this fun, fancy stuff. It made it work. It's kind of cool what people are able to accomplish. But I think that more cool than that is the cartridge that allowed you to plug in additional controllers.
That is very neat.
I've never heard of something like that, so that just blows my mind.
That is incredibly cool. No doubt about it.
What about yourself? What's your big takeaways for the day?
I very much liked, since you took the J cart for starters, since you took the J cart, I'm going to take the fact that they had to build a patch chip into the original Micro Machines game. They essentially had to patch their game with a little chip because they messed up for a single byte. Like, that's just such a funny concept.
I mean, it's also cool when you think about it that it was so easy to fix that, like, hey, chip, done.
In case you're wondering, there were 6 J-Cart games. J-Cart cartridge was made for the Sega Genesis. And those 6 games were 2 tennis titles, 3 Micro Machines titles, including Micro Machines 2, Micro Machines 96 that we didn't really talk about, and Micro Machines Military. And then there was a game that actually fits your underwear collection called Super Skid Marks.
What the Okay. All right, good one.
Thanks. Super Skid Marks is a racing video game. Another minimally realistic action racer viewed from the isometric perspective that has novelty vehicles such as wheeled cows and caravans.
Nice.
Yeah,
That's cool.
yeah. So yeah, micro machines were cool. I had them. I loved them. I have no complaints about them. That's a great time. So Rob, on that note, before I take it out of here and into next week, is there anything you'd like to add to today's episode?
I'll just take one moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world to have you along as we take this micro-sized journey down memory card lane.
At the finish line of Micro Machines, what stands out isn't just the racing, but the way something so small managed to feel so big. Codemasters took a toy line barely 2 inches long and turned it into a video game that filled living rooms with laughter and chaos. It didn't need realism, didn't need flashy graphics, didn't need complex storylines. It just needed the creativity and simple joy of competition. By transforming breakfast tables and school desks and garden patios into racetracks, the series reminded players that imagination can make any space extraordinary. And while the toys themselves eventually faded from store shelves, the games themselves left behind a legacy of innovation, proving that multiplayer fun doesn't have to be complicated to be unforgettable. So, whether you remember falling off the pool table or shouting at your friends during a 4 player J Kart section, or just lining up toy cars on your kitchen floor, Micro Machines again reminds us that sometimes the smallest ideas can leave the largest tracks in gaming history. Next week, we're swapping out tiny cars for big explosions. In 2005, Pandemic Studios released Mercenaries Playground of Destruction, an open world action game that gave players total freedom to cause chaos. Set against the backdrop of a fictional war torn North Korea, it let you topple buildings, hijack vehicles, and unleash an arsenal of firepower on just about anything in sight. Marketed as a true playground of destruction, it stood out for its destructible environments, over the top missions, and the sheer fun of experimenting with mayhem. Join us as we dig into the story behind Pandemic Studios, the making of Mercenaries, and how this cult favorite paved the way for a new era of sandbox action. On next week's explosive trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Ba-ba-dum, ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da, Micro Machines.